Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion on plastering and the process materials and actually the lack of skilled craftsmen we not only have in southern New Jersey but in the whole Mid-Atlantic region, which is quite the loss because we have a lot of historic homes, unfortunately, which again I'm more apt to be in the southern New Jersey, south of Trenton area, that we have homeowners that are resisting the temptation and they're having sheetrock drywall put up instead of having a plaster come in. And there's too many 18th century dwellings that have undergone this type of so-called restoration, which it's actually a bastardization, unfortunately. And what I'm finding in many of the homes, particularly in Salem County, is the probably in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and it could be one of the homeowners' economics. It could be lack of even skilled craftsmen some 80 years ago that they used cement as plaster, actually Portland style cement. And unfortunately, what it's done, particularly with the lath and post and beam construction, it's caused number one kind of a storage of moisture between the cement surface and the wood, and there's certain minerals that actually do degradation to the wood surface. So, and just as kind of a side note, it's interesting because there are literally thousands and thousands of highly skilled plasters throughout England. And it's interesting that when you have an apartment building that was painted or papered, you'll have guys come in and put a skim coat of traditional plaster in, as opposed to here uh, we just do some drywalling. We'll do some spackling, and then we'll do some painting. So that's how prevalent they are, and it's no different, as we have spoken in other videos, in the horological field, that there are hundreds and hundreds of meetings a week throughout Britain of horological topics and enigmas. And here in America, we probably have 4 or 5 in an entire year. So it just shows you how still, after as long as we've been a nation, our craft has not caught up with our European ancestors. So it's very, very disheartening. And and to revisit some of the historic houses we have in the 18th century, particularly in Salem County, that I don't think people are aware of what they should be. They bring a contractor in, they assume this individual knows what he's doing, and he sheetrocks and he uses typical balloon construction, and he's using uh, typical balloon timbering, which is 2x4s essentially, and typical common nails. And this is anything farther from the truth. And it shouldn't happen because they're causing further degradation to their period homes, and they don't even realize it. So the homeowners have got to align themselves with a conservator, a scholar, as opposed to just builders and really C-rate architects in this area. So, well, anyway, let us continue. Enough of that. Let's continue on with our program here of plastering. And we're going to talk about retardant. Too much retardant. Retardant agents are added to slow down the rate at which plaster sets, and thus inhibit hardening. They have traditionally included ammonia, glue, gelatin, starch, molasses, or vegetable oil. If the plaster has used too much retardant, however, a gypsum plaster will not set in a normal 20 to 30 minute period. As a result, the surface becomes quite soft and powdery for the duration of its life. Inadequate plaster thicknesses. Plaster is applied in 3 coats over wood lath and or metal lath, primarily in England, or at times used here in the States. The scratch, brown, and finish coats. In the 3-coat system, the scratch coat and brown coat were sometimes applied on successive days to make up the required wall thickness. Sometimes it's good to put a wet coat on a wet coat just before it dries. It's a better bonding agent. Using Rothlath allowed the plaster to apply 1 base coat and the finish coat on a 2-coat job. If a plaster skimped on materials, the wall may not have sufficient thickness to withstand normal stresses of a building structure and aging. The minimum total thickness for a plaster or gypsum board is 1/2 inch. Metal lath, the minimum thickness is 5/8 of an inch. And for wood lath, it's about 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch. The minimum plaster thickness may affect the thickness of trim projecting from the wall's plane. Let's talk a bit about improper curing. Proper temperature and air circulation during curing are key factors in a plaster's job. The ideal temperature for plaster to cure is between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. However, historic houses are sometimes plastered before window sashes were put in. And the problem is you have some clients that like to speed up the process, and before they actually moved in and there's no heat in the house, they want plasterers to move in or want me to come in and do a plastering job, and it just won't happen. There was no way to control the temperature and humidity. Dry out, freezing, and sweat out. When temperatures were too hot, the plaster would return to its original condition before it was mixed with water. That is, calcified gypsum. A plaster would have to spray with alum water to reset the plaster. If freezing occurs before the plaster is set, the job will simply have to be totally redone. Everything is ripped off the walls, the lath, the plaster, and we must start over under the proper temperatures. If the windows were shut so that the air could not circulate, the plaster was subject to sweat out or rot. There's no cure for rotted plaster. The affected air had to be removed and replastered also. A word about moisture. Plaster applied to the masonry wall is vulnerable to damage if the wall is constantly wet. When salts from the masonry substrate come in contact with the water, they migrate to the surface of the plaster, appearing as dry bubbles or efflorescence. The source of the moisture must be eliminated before replastering damaged areas. And as we said earlier, this is a problem I'm running into where the homes that were plastered in the 30s and 40s, where they had a lot of leakage and a lot of wet damp, and then it activated the plaster to cause actually damage and degradation to the wood. Sources of water damage. Moisture problems occur for several reasons. Interior plumbing leaks in older houses, roof leaks, as I run across quite often, causing ceiling damage. Gutters and downspouts may also leak, pouring rain into the building's foundation. In brick buildings, however, dampness at the foundation level can wick up above the grade walls. Another common source of moisture is splashback, when there's paved areas next to the masonry building. Rainwater splashing up from the paved area can dampen masonry walls. I ran into this when we have an alleyway between two historic 18th century buildings and we have a very prolific rain. In both cases, water travels through the masonry and damages interior plaster. Coatings applied to the interior are not effective in the long run of subduing this problem. The moisture problem can be stopped on the outside of the wall only. Repairing historic plaster. This is where the restorer, the conservator comes in and really puts these fly-by-night type carpenters out the door. Many of the problems described above are not easily remedied. If major structural problems are found to be the source of the plaster problem, the structural problem should be corrected. Some repairs can be repaired by removing small sections of the plaster to gain access to diagnose the situation. Minor structural problems that will not endanger the building can generally be ignored. Cosmetic damage from minor building movement, holes or boat areas can be repaired without the need of wholesale demolition. And keep in mind, these illegitimate carpenters love wholesale demolition, ripping your walls out and putting sheetrock up. So don't succumb to their needs. However, it may be necessary to remove deteriorated plaster caused by rising damp in order for masonry walls to dry out. Repairs made to a wet base will fail again and again and again. Canvassing uneven wall surfaces. Uneven wall surfaces caused by previous patching or a partial wallpaper removal are common in old houses. As long as the plaster is generally sound, cosmetically unattractive, plaster walls can be wallpapered with strips of canvas or fabric-like material. Historically, canvassing covering imperfections in the plaster can provide a stable base for decorative painting or wallpaper. Filling cracks. Hairline cracks in wall and ceiling plaster are not a serious concern of mine, as long as the underlying plaster is in good condition. They must be filled easily with a patching material. For cracks that reopen with season humidity change, a slightly different methodology is used for our corporation. First, the crack is widened slightly with a sharp, pointed tool, such as a crack widener, of course, or a triangular can opener. Then the crack is filled. For more persistent cracks, it may be necessary to bridge the crack with tape. For this instance, a fiberglass mesh tape is pressed into the patching material. After the first application of a quick setting joint compound, when this dries, a second coat is applied to cover the tape, feathering in at all the edges. A third coat is applied to even out the surface, followed by a light sanding. The area is cleaned off with a damp sponge and then dried to clean off any plaster residue or dust. When cracks are larger and due to structural movement, repairs must be made to the superstructure of the system before the repairs or restoration can be undertaken. Then, the plaster on each side of the crack should be removed to a width about 6 inches back, down to the base of the lath itself. The debris is cleaned out and the metal lath is applied to the cleared area. So where structural areas rebound, metal lath is a choice. Even in 18th century, this is good conservation principles. The crack is patched with an appropriate plaster in the traditional 3-layer system. If the crack seems to be expanding, a structural engineer should be consulted. So for more than 2 times of the very wide cracks, call a structural engineer. Replacing delaminated areas of the finished coat. Sometimes the finished coat of a plaster comes loose from the base coat. In making this type of repair, the plaster paints a liquid bonding agent on the areas of the base coat plaster that will be replastered with a new lime finish coat. A homeowner wishing to repair small areas of delaminated finish coat can use the methods that we described in patching materials. Just